The Liberty City Psychiatric Center is home to many patients that are mentally ill and often experience trauma throughout their life that has left them affected for a long run. One of those patients that fell victim to such trauma is a 19-year-old man by the name of John Lynch. John Lynch unfortunately has voices in his head that pressure him to inflict harm beyond his control and taunts his emotions, using them to manipulate him into doing things he doesn't approve of. These voices speak to John when John is experiencing high intensity of stress, anger, and guilt, making him force violence upon others. Throughout the time John Lynch has been at the psychiatric center, his condition has only gotten worse, to the point where he would randomly attempt to assault any nurses or counselors that tried to help him in any way, steal, and escape his room on many occasions. Later on, John was transferred from the psychiatric center to another institution located in Carson City. This new institution was sketchy, but that was only an assumption for now. After arrival at the new institution, John would attend therapy sessions for his tragic condition. John was met by Dr. Crane, who was a specialist in psychology and medicine. During his session, the doctor would ask John personal questions about his upbringing, condition, and what happened to make him have it. John would answer. John was a lonely kid ever since he was little to being 10 years old at the time, who didn't have much in his earlier days and lived with his parents. His father was a mechanic and his mother was a waiter. John didn't like being alone, but his parents almost always had to work, so he was often with a babysitter. John often watched television, as for him it was an escape from reality. However, that wasn't his only hobby. See, since John was such a lonely kid, he never really had anyone to talk to. There was one thing that he would speak to, and that was his best friend. This best friend was like a companion that John would have by his side at all times. Anywhere John went, his best friend was right by his side. However, this best friend wasn't alive or a living person. John's best friend was a ventriloquist doll. His name was Frisbee. John loved Frisbee and remembers having Frisbee by his side as long as he can remember. He would play with Frisbee, crack jokes, and often talk about embracing the worst days in hopes for better ones. John treated Frisbee like a much younger sibling, and that's what made Frisbee feel special to John. Like Frisbee always needed to be there, and without his presence, John would just feel more lonely. I guess you could somewhat compare their relationship to Andy and Chucky in the first Child's Play film. Though Frisbee made John feel less lonely, the harsh reality of it all is that John was always lonely, considering Frisbee is not actually capable of speaking to John. John was always speaking to himself. One night of that same year in 2003, this all changed. When John and Frisbee was watching their favorite cartoon, something weird happened. During the airing of the cartoon, the screen started to glitch. The television looked like it was malfunctioning, but it slowly transitioned to a man in what looked like a prison shirt hiding in the shadows of some remote location. John was confused by what was going on, but curious to see what this strange activity was all about. John then started to see the man slowly creep up on the man from the shadows and execute him in the most gruesome way imaginable. John was speechless, shocked, and frozen in fear, but kept watching the carnage escalate on screen. It was terrible to bear since John would constantly swallow the vomit that immediately wanted to exit his throat, but he was strangely fascinated by what he was seeing. He didn't know if it was legit or some odd cruel prank, but it was something that was new to him, something he had never seen before. It seemed so surreal but unnerved him so much. After having watched through the whole carnage that was on screen, the cartoon resumed, as if the horror that aired before the cartoon was non-existent. In utter fear, John finally shut off the television. He couldn't fathom what he had just witnessed and didn't know what to do. That was until something also weird happened. Frisbee started to speak to John. Frisbee had this disturbingly calm and mellow voice, shaming John for watching what he just witnessed. The best voice to compare Frisbee to would be a character like Barney, the dinosaur.
People you love, I love you, you love me.
John, in disbelief by what he's hearing, glances at Frisbee in terror. He couldn't see the doll deliberately moving any part of his body, but he heard the voices coming directly from the doll. Frisbee would continue to shame John, saying things like, "I can't believe you actually watched us, and you should harm yourself for enjoying such cruelty." John would attempt to convince Frisbee that it wasn't his fault, telling him that this all happened out of nowhere and without his control. Frisbee, without remorse, continues to guilt trip John, considering John sat through the whole experience, watching every murder occur on the screen. Frisbee believes John should punish himself for the happening of tonight, persuading John to kill his parents where he could live the rest of his life knowing that their lives are lost because of him. Though John never really got along with his parents, he still felt that they didn't deserve to die, especially in a horrific manner. But unfortunately, the voices started to get a hold of younger John, making him lose his sense and take full control of his psyche. Later that night, Younger John grabbed a kitchen knife and went into his parents' bedroom where he could see them deep asleep. Frisbee, sounding like a broken record, kept egging John to do it. John would then nonchalantly walk up to his mother and slit her throat from ear to ear. John was emotionless, not feeling an ounce of empathy for what he just did. Surprisingly, the father didn't hear the mother choking on her own blood. John would then go up to his father's side of the bed and mercilessly stab his father in the face numerous times, digging out most of the anatomy in his head with his bare hands. After standing there for a brief moment, realizing what he just did, John called the police and reported the crime. When police showed up, John was found covered in blood, as if he just swam in the pool of it. John stood there with a knife in his hand, glaring at what he just did. When 2 officers walked in on the scene, they told John what happened here. John slowly turned his head in the direction of the police and said, "Frisbee did it." Younger John was then sent to a juvenile detention center for 3 years before he was later transferred to the psychiatric center, where he would stay there all his life until 2012, before being transferred to this institution in Carson City the same year. When Dr. Crane heard John's story, he was deeply saddened by what he heard. He can see the pain in John's eyes and knew he wasn't lying about the events that had transpired. Dr. Crane would tell John that he believes him. Dr. Crane mentioned that he heard this story about this random man killing people, which happened to all be recorded for some sick snuff film. He told John that it was headlined on the news but was ultimately hidden from public eyes, considering most people thought the reporter was just losing it and that she might have been a possible suspect in her own story, since they couldn't find the man who was apparently responsible for this bloody massacre. The story was later suspiciously classified by law, and it's almost like it never really existed. Now John was surprised by this because it's rare for someone to actually believe what he's been through and what he's witnessed from his traumatic past. Luckily, Dr. Crane was one of the rare few who's heard about this snuff film story and never brushed it under the rug, even after the controversy. It stuck with Dr. Crane ever since because Dr. Crane knew, since it's apparently the snuff film that John so happened to witness in full, who was the one who distributed the film in the first place, releasing it to the public eye. John mentions that this film technically ruined his life, turning him into a disturbed, unhinged madman who could hear the voices of his best friend momentarily. He mentions that he never meant to hurt his parents, though they weren't really in his life. John, feeling completely defeated and robbed from life, asks Dr. Crane one possibility. Can he make John forget? Make him forget his horrible past, where he can at least wake up every day not knowing what he was responsible for. Dr. Crane understands John's concern of him wanting to rid his past memories and having to deal with living with limitless guilt. Dr. Crane then mentions that he used to work with an organization full of scientists that conducted experiments on people for their own well-being, quote unquote. This organization was called the Pikman Project. He mentions how he was good friends with Dr. Pikman, who was the founder of the Pikman Project, and they were a well-working organization at first, until the US government cut their funding because their work methods were deemed cruel and inhumane. John is then confused by why Dr. Crane is letting him know all this in the first place. Dr. Crane tells John that he's capable of making John forget his past, but ever since Dr. Pikman passed away, they put those type of experiments to rest and don't use them for any further cause. Dr. Crane adds that if he even did go through with the experiment, it can be fatal to the brain, causing the brain to become completely vulnerable and die from brain failure, almost like a neurologic death. John gazes at Dr. Crane in huge disappointment and decides he'd rather be safe than sorry. Unfortunately, there's no alternative way around the one procedure, so John strongly accepted the decline and was escorted to the room he would be staying in. That same night, a guard who kept tabs on patients, making sure they weren't doing anything out of the ordinary, checked on John in his room. Everything was fine until John realized that the guard dropped the keys to the room right by the door, just waiting for John to pick them up. Moments after the guard had left, John heard loud screaming coming from nearby his room. John was the only patient on the 3rd floor, so he was the only one able to hear it. Curiosity got the better of John, and this led John to pick up the keys. John then unlocked his room door and was on his way to inspect what the screams were coming from. John managed to roam the institution quietly so he could hopefully get an idea of what's going on. As he went down the stairs into one of the corridors, a faint scream coming from one of the doors in the hallway caught John's attention. The door was cracked open a bit. When John went to go peek through the crack, he can see one of the patient's teeth being viciously yanked out with a pliers wrench by one of the nurses. John, horrified by what he sees, gets flashbacks from the film that made him go crazy. He then starts hearing the voices of Frisbee in his head, telling him to murder these shady people. The voice disrupts John's awareness of what's going on in this situation, and the nurses end up hearing John's grunts of pain. In the panic, John sprints away to find a hiding spot in the darkness, hiding from the nurses who are trying to find him. John quietly enters the staff room and finds a crowbar sitting by one of the counters. John equips the crowbar with his shaking and scared hands to then hear Frisbee demand John to kill the nurses looking for him. John, of course, listening to Frisbee, silently murders every nurse in his way. John then achieves a keycard from one of the nurses' back pockets. John, still disturbed and confused by what exactly is going on, flees the institution in one piece. So he thought. When John left the institution and fled into the streets of Carson City, he didn't know what his next move was because everything happened so fast, like a blink of an eye. John notices that Carson City looks completely abandoned. Maybe it's because it's midnight, but this place does look familiar, like if he's seen it before. As John attempts to look for help, he notices a man with a black formal suit wearing a ski mask, holding a baton in the middle of the street. This man didn't look too friendly, so John decides to keep to the shadows instead of asking for help. He then saw another man in a black formal suit holding a handgun, walking around the sidewalk, close to where the other man was standing. Something didn't seem right. It appeared as if these men were looking for something, but John didn't understand what. These men were the Watchdogs, an organization of highly trained killers who used to work with the project when the project was still around. Maybe they're the reason why this area is so abandoned, he thought. John, already on the fence by what's happening, starts to feel this sense of danger, which makes him more stressed. Frisbee starts telling John that he can't give up now because if John dies, Frisbee is gone too. As much as John already despised Frisbee now because of what he made him go through, survival was John's only priority. So he knew Frisbee would have to be essential in this type of situation involving getting John's hands dirty. John kept to the shadows, finding a glass shard in the process, and had to eliminate these hunters quietly for a chance of hopefully finding help in this deserted city. John never was a fan of violence, but since Frisbee was always there to technically do the killing for him, John knew he would be responsible for the murders, but he would have no memory of what he actually just did. Why these men were here looking for John was unknown, but John just knew he had to get out of here. Since these men were almost like an extra barrier he had to get past besides the nurses at that shady institution. As John starts running through the deserted streets of Carson City, he feels a spike hit his right shoulder blade at great force. John starts feeling disoriented by the spike and slowly starts to faint, hitting the cold concrete. John was shot by a tranquilizer rifle. John, immobilized in the chair, is then awakened by a familiar voice telling him to wake up. The voice doesn't sound too clear, but as John slowly starts to regain consciousness, he realizes that the voice is none other than Dr. Crane himself. He tells John that he's been watching him since he was little and seen everything that happened with John, his parents, and Frisbee. He explains how he created a drug named the sanity serum that can corrupt one's sanity by creating a second personality within the mind, making one lose control of their own psyche and become more physically powerful in the process. He injected the serum inside John's brain pre-birth to get stronger development effects from the serum, and that's why Frisbee exists in John's head in the first place. John, clearly shocked by what he's hearing, states that this is all a lie because his parents wouldn't let that happen. Dr. Crane had then shown John an old VHS tape where Dr. Crane was recording himself experimenting like John's pregnant mother while his father watched. Sadly, it was nothing but the truth. Dr. Crane told John that his parents needed the money because John was a mistake and they could barely provide for themselves. That was until Dr. Crane, who was John's parents' doctor at the time and worked with the project on the low, gave them the idea to test his product on John for a pre-settlement of $10,000 before he was even delivered. However, if the experiment was successful, they would get a lifetime settlement of money. He mentions how ever since he's been watching John, he hasn't noticed anything connected to the serum in John's behavior, except the incident that happened with his parents in 2003. Because of this incident, Pikman told Dr. Crane not to exceed with the experiment and leave it be until the right measures were associated. John was the beta of Project Pikman Bridge that was then abandoned. Pikman Bridge was the name of the experiment involving Daniel Lamb, which takes a normal individual and implants a second personality once sugared at will. Where the doctor made it error in this beta experiment is that the drug effects only kick in when something dramatic triggers the brain. That's why when John saw the snuff film, he started to experience what he's experiencing now. The goal for the new formula was to make the serum more controllable via sound frequencies and amplify its effects even more to the highest possible dose. John, still in disbelief, told Dr. Crane why it's him he all of a sudden wants to go after now, considering history is history and whatever happened happened. Dr. Crane told John that he's simply an unfinished experiment that can still serve value for himself and the project as long as he modifies the formula for his sanity serum. Allowing the US government to use this powerful serum on their soldiers for the project can continue getting government funding again. He tried to test the same serum on various patients, but all processes failed. The serum would work on patients at first through force trauma, until shortly they would die of neurological failure. It's funny because Dr. Crane's serum was more superior than the methods the project used on Daniel. John was special. He goes on to mention that the whole reason why the experiment was conducted in the first place is because the project already had worries in the past of the US government potentially cutting their funding due to the controversial work methods of the experiments they were working on. That was until their government fundings did get cut, so they tested on Danny, which went horribly wrong, leading to Pikman being killed and Daniel Lamb going missing. Dr. Crane then stated that with a little help, he He was capable of tracking John down, transferring him on the low, and that's why they're here, where they are now. John was disgusted to hear what came out of Dr. Crane's mouth, but he knew Dr. Crane couldn't be making this up. John's life was an experiment this whole time. No wonder his parents were barely there and felt like they didn't want to take care of him, but had to for the meantime in case the experiment finally became a success. Which it did, but didn't at the same time. Fueled by hate, rage, and adrenaline, John managed to break out of the metal locked chair that was immobilizing him. Dr. Crane was surprised by this, yet satisfied because he knew this was the serum's work of making that happen. But as John was freeing himself from the metallic locks, Dr. Crane was running away from the scene that was about to transpire. Realizing the situation that he's in, John notices that he's in some type of slaughterhouse. He can hear screams that sound like they came directly from a horror movie. Upon seeing what the noise is all about, John sees 5 men who appear to be wearing human skin, wielding bone knives. He was anxious to find where Dr. Crane had gone, but he knew he had to get past these guys first. These guys were the Skinwalkers, a gang of vicious predators who can smell the blood of their victims, tracking them down in the process, flaying them, killing them, and wearing their skin as some sort of appreciation for their kill. This gang was heavily inspired by Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. When taking any damage against these guys, the player constantly would have to move around the shadows to not get their blood tracked or just try not to get attacked by them. John wasn't familiar with these guys, but he knew he had to take it easy and eliminate them one by one, since apparently there were more than just 5 of these creeps in the slaughterhouse. After disposing of the gang and leaving the slaughterhouse, John finds himself in another remote location that just doesn't seem right. This place was interconnected to the slaughterhouse, which he found odd. It was this very dark warehouse that barely had any light. John gets an uneasy feeling that someone is watching him from the shadows, but he couldn't decipher what it is. Staying in the shower trying to get out of the warehouse, John then feels breathing on his neck. John quickly turns around in fear to see a hunter dressed in all black, wearing a hood with a faceless mask. These guys were the Midnight Stalkers, a gang of mute hunters that temporarily linger in the shadows as their advantage to hunt people down. The player will have to be extremely aware of where they're hiding, considering one of them can be right behind them. Sometimes the player can hear them breathing in the shadows, so they know that's when it's a good time to run. For the name of this gang, I got some inspiration from the Night Stalker, who was a very real serial killer back in the 80s. This catches John by surprise, but he knows what has to be done considering everyone he's running into just isn't up to no good. So of course Frisbee takes control in the process. After a deadly but quiet onslaught against the Midnight Stalkers, John proceeded to find Dr. Crane, who was probably long gone by now. After cutting through the abandoned warehouse, which seemed like it was clear, John then enters some sort of industrial plant facility. Without hurrying, taking in what he's looking at. In John's mind, he knows that something must have been planned here. There's no way that one remote location that's filled with hunters then leads to the next with the same outcome. It's almost like an endless cycle of death. Like if someone orchestrated this whole nightmare just to get John killed, he figured. But who? It had to be Dr. Crane, right? As John starts to roam through the eerie industrial plant, he begins to realize that inside the plant was getting excessively foggy. It wasn't this foggy when he had entered. Anxiously waiting for the smoke to clear away, John could then see silhouettes of 3 guys coming through the smoke. John in a hurry scurries to hide behind a nearby pole, attempting not to cough from the smoke that keeps coming his direction. He could then hear one of the men say that John was nearby, hiding somewhere, and that Dr. Crane still wanted his head on his shoulders. They then continued to toss smoke grenades around until they could hear John, knowing that John can't resist the smoke for too long. This gang was called the Marauders, a group of mercenaries wearing gas masks that use smoke to their advantage, throwing smoke grenades around areas they're locating. The player will have a lung capacity meter when facing these guys, allowing the player to hold his breath temporarily before gasping for air and coughing, revealing the player's location in the process. To counter them, the player has to either kill a marauder, taking their gas mask to resist the smoke, or throw bricks away from the location they're hiding in as a decoy, throwing the marauders off temporarily. These guys were all wielding shotguns, which made the experience all the more horrifying, as just one sound can end John's life in a heartbeat. John then looked down to see a brick near his foot. Without hesitation, John threw the brick away from where he was hidden. Some of the marauders checked it out, but one was still lurking around the area John was hidden. When the hunter finally had his back turned, John finished him with a brick, taking both his gas mask and his gun. After disposing of most of the marauders, John interrogated the remaining hunter, demanding where he could find Dr. Crane. After breaking both the hunter's ankles and kneecaps with the barrel of the shotgun, the hunter confessed Dr. Crane's location. Dr. Crane was in his lab that's located in a bunker beneath the hunting trials. John then finishes him with a shotgun blow to the head. At this point, the 4 gangs mentioned aren't the only hunters that would be in the game. Throughout the game, every level is like its own trial of death, with certain objectives and gangs you have to get past. All gangs will play in their own unique way, making them creative threats. There will be far more gangs, but for the sake of this story's duration, it's shortened to 4. After the blood and carnage that ensued, John couldn't help but feel like he was the man in the snuff film that he watched when he was 10 years of age. Getting closer and closer to Dr. Crane's lab in the bunker, John could see the entrance to the lab just a few feet away. On arrival at the entrance, John realized that the door to the lab was open, which he found pretty suspicious. The door wouldn't be left open in a place as secret as this. After making his way through the entrance door, John roams through the narrow hallway which leads to another door up ahead. When John opens the door, all he can see is a wall full of monitors. Monitors that were watching the patients back at the institution who still happened to be there. John even saw his room from the monitor. From the sight of this, something had hit John. If John and the patients were being monitored by Dr. Crane this whole time, why didn't they stop John when he was unlocking the door to his room and escaping? John can also see a collage of articles on the wall written all over with red marker of various topics, including cases of missing people who all happened to vanish within a town near Carson City, the disappearance of a businessman named Donald Love who lived in Liberty City, and suspicion about what exactly the project was doing to the patients to make their work ethics so inhumane. After the thought of this, John then feels a syringe pierce in the back of his neck, making him slightly disoriented and barely able to move. Dr. Crane had snuck up behind John. While John was immobilized, Dr. Crane then praised John for making it so far, considering he really should be dead by now, and that no one else made it this far. John, perplexed by what he just heard, stated, "What do you mean, no one else?" Dr. Crane then explained to John that this institution was actually just a holding chamber for people who would be forced to participate in the hunting trials, which is what John just fought all night through. He mentions that the project would conduct various experiments on these quote-unquote patients without their consent, and after they were done experimenting on these patients, they would be forced into the hunting trials. Patients that attempted to refuse would be tortured and tormented, making their demise all the more inevitable. John then tells Dr. Crane why he didn't stop him once he saw John escape. Dr. Crane tells John that this was all set up to happen, since he was confident that once John was located and secured inside the chambers, that there wasn't any getting out regardless. So he wanted John to experience the horrifying trials before finally finishing what he had started years ago, seeing if the serum was developed to its highest degree, considering John survived the near impossible, making the project whole again. Dr. Crane then mentions that without him, any of this wouldn't be possible. Without who? John stated. Dr. Crane replied, "The man in mischief. Calls himself Mr. Nasty." Dr. Crane mentions that after the funding from the US was cut and Daniel Lamb went missing, he surfaced the black market in an attempt to contact bounty hunters to track both Daniel Lamb and John Lynch. He then found a site by the name of Valiant Radio Enterprises, with its creator being none other than Mr. Nasty. He then mentions how he contacted Mr. Nasty for business inquiries, finding these targets in return for a short settlement of $25,000. The plan was to locate John, which Mr. Nasty had to bribe some of the nurses and guards into letting John come with those posers, collect the rare serum formula that happened to work on John's brain, modifying the serum by enhancing its stability through sound frequencies, making the host resist control, and overdose his physical capabilities. Dr. Crane was then going to duplicate this formula and give it to the US government so the government can use the formula on the military, making the results a compelling success compared to what had happened in the past. This process would have made the US government resume funding for the project, and Mr. Nasty will always get 50% of that funding from the project. Everything was technically orchestrated by him, since he was the only one in contact that had the money to set up everything of use, not only for the project, but for his infamous snuff films that he's recorded, is now recording during the hunting trials, and produced. John, sounding completely defeated, utters to Dr. Crane, "You're a monster. A cold, disgraceful, and dickless monster." Dr. Crane can see the pain in John's eyes, but he knows what must be done for his own enrichment. He really doesn't care about John, but views his pain as wealth to have in the palm of his hand. Dr. Crane then says to John, "I was sorry, ever since the beginning." Dr. Crane then raises the shotgun at John's chest from a distance, firing the trigger. John was dead, laying in the pool of his own blood. Dr. Crane, calmly relieved by this, gets his equipment from one of the following rooms next door to the security room for the formula suction. After returning back, John had vanished. The only thing that remained from him was his fresh blood lying on the ground. Paranoid, Dr. Crane looked around frantically for where John could have possibly gone while wielding a shotgun. Screaming and yelling to John the only reason he matters is for others' fulfillment. Dr. Crane then gets stabbed right beneath the crotch, screaming in pain. John then moves in front of Dr. Crane, glaring at him like an emotionless, soulless demon. Dr. Crane says, "You don't win, John." John then says to Dr. Crane, "This isn't John," before relentlessly stabbing a knife through the top of Dr. Crane's brain, splitting his head in half horizontally with his bare hands. Without even looking back, John opens the emergency door for the stairway from the lab that leads straight to the crime-infested streets of Carson City. Filled with aggression, evil, and dreariness, John kept walking in the streets of Carson. He doesn't know where he's going, he doesn't know his purpose, never to be seen again. A news report from Carson City News then cuts on. It shows a reporter explaining how there have been multiple genocides in the past couple of weeks within Carson City from an unknown serial killer who looks to be targeting mainly gangs within Carson whose bodies have been found mutilated. The whereabouts of this mysterious serial killer is completely unknown. The hunting trials would be the online mode where the player can customize their own patient who is locked up in the chambers. After customization, the player can choose one of the 4 online modes to play. One of the modes is Onslaughter, a PvE mode where 4 players, 2 players minimum, have to team up to take out 20 hunters in each hunting zone with their own unique playstyle. Each time the players take out all the hunters in the area, they then have to go into another area with a different variety of hunters. There will be 5 hunting zones. This mode will feel pretty similar to Hunter mode in Splinter Cell Conviction, except it's creepy because it's Manhunt. Each gang changes every time all players complete a hunting zone together. If a player dies, they can no longer respawn until the next hunting zone, but the existing players or player must rescue the player that died from a chamber located in each hunting zone. Each player starts off empty-handed and will have to scavenge the area in hopes of not getting caught to find weapons, painkillers, and resources to distract hunters. All players win when each hunting zone has been completed. Brawl Game is a PvP mode for up to 20 players, 10 players minimum, where no player can hide and have to fight each other using melee weapons. This mode has 2 variations. In Brawl Game Free For All, it's each player for themselves that must reach the highest kill count in the lobby within the time limit in order to win. Each player has unlimited respawns. In Brawl Game Team Deathmatch, the players are split into teams of 2 groups, whether it's 10v10 or 5v5. Each team must reach the highest kill count altogether in the lobby within the time limit in order to win. Each player has unlimited respawns. Hide and Seek is a PvP mode for up to 10 players, 8 players minimum. In Hide and Seek, there's 1 seeker and 9 hiders, 7 hiders if there's only 8 players. The seeker starts off with a double-barrel shotgun. The hiders start off empty-handed and must collect melee weapons around the area. The seeker must seek and execute as many hiders as possible. The hiders must sneak around and collect melee weapons and attempt to execute the seeker as many times as possible. Whichever hider executes the seeker, that hider would then become the seeker. The previous seeker will become a hider. Whoever gets the highest kill count in the lobby within the time limit wins the game. Each player has unlimited respawns. The Hunting Trials also offer mental state points, which is this game's currency. The player can purchase various content such as appearance and weapon cosmetics, new executions for each weapon, and new animations for their character. A gameplay element that will return is the combos from Manhunt 1. The player can perform a combo with the weapon by pressing both the light and heavy attack buttons simultaneously. This added to the standard light and attack, making the combat a bit more spicy. Parrying would be added as a benefit for combat. It will reward the player for blocking an attack just at the right time by immediately countering an attack in exchange for their own. This will make the flow of the combat more dynamic. The gameplay element to perform executions from above would definitely have to return. It was so cool jumping down on hunters and performing a special execution aside from the regular executions you could perform. The gameplay element to climb would be added, as well as a jump button for the player to jump into a climbing animation. A crouch button would be added to conceal the player more effectively in the shadows. Environmental executions will return as a gameplay element. In Manhunt 2 on the Wii, the player can virtually perform an execution by following the motion prompts on the screen. This gameplay element will return as an option in settings exclusively for PlayStation players, considering the player can use the motion of the controller to perform the execution, as well as use the controller to alert hunters by virtually hitting a surface. The motion mechanics would be a single player only option. A rare gameplay element from Manhunt 1 that will return would be the option for your headset to be a playable factor within the game. This means that the sound from your headset can be used to alert the hunters, making the gameplay more immersive, considering you will have to play in a quiet room and make zero noise when the hunter is nearby. In the Hunting Trials, a feature that would be added is the voice of Mr. Nasty, who speaks through the speakers and records the trials as they go on. I think it would be cool if Mr. Nasty had a Billy the Puppet-esque voice, since it perfectly suits the dark and disturbing atmosphere of the game.
I want to play a game.
The trials will also feature returning playable maps from both Manhunt 1 and Manhunt 2 that can be used in each game mode. In this Manhunt Requel, I wanted to combine the first Manhunt storyline to the second Manhunt storyline, so that way it would feel like a complete Requel including both games from the franchise into one story. Frisbee was a beta character removed from Manhunt 2 that was supposed to play the main antagonist. His purpose in the beta was to encourage Daniel Lamb, or Cash, considering in some sites on the internet it says Cash instead of Danny, to kill people. almost like Leo does to Danny in the game. I wanted to include this character because I felt like it could have given Manhunt 2 a creepier aesthetic if done the right way. The Manhunt 2 beta menu has an unsettling vibe to it. Here's the menu in case you haven't seen it yet. This made me genuinely curious where Rockstar was going with this character, and how the game would have gone if this is what they decided to go with. I feel like Frisbee always interested me as a character because he was supposed to play a core part in the game, but got removed. I'd love to hear a mention of the character if Rockstar decided to finally drop a Manhunt 3, which I truly doubt. It seems like they always had the project in mind considering there's a book with the logo on it shown, but their purpose in the beta could have been way different from what their published purpose was in the game. I wanted to give Manhunt 2 more shine considering I made a separate video idea on what Manhunt 3 can look like, featuring Cash getting sucked right back into the snuff film ring and taking down Mr. Nasty, ending Valiant Video Enterprises once and for all. If you plan on checking that video out, beware my atrocious microphone and forgive me, but the link for that video is in the description. What I felt the first Manhunt done right was the gangs and how scary they look, so I felt like that had to play an integral part in the story, because if it's not gangs and groups of people doing this that look creepy, they would just look like standard people like how they did in Manhunt 2, and I really love the aesthetic in Manhunt 1. I feel like if Manhunt was to make a sudden comeback, they should definitely include an online mode. Don't get me wrong, there's other ways to extend the durability of a game, but I feel like with a game like Manhunt, the online potential would be massive and a fun time. For online, I took huge inspiration from the bonus Manhunt scenes in the first game like Brawl Game, Splinter Cell Conviction Hunter mode, the Warriors Rumble mode, and GTA 5's online slasher mode. But what makes online scary in a game like Manhunt is that it's an actual player trying to hunt you down rather than the NPC. I can see NPCs being pretty smart in the modern day Manhunt game, especially since it's made by Rockstar, but for an actual player with self-awareness trying to hunt you down would make for a thrilling experience. If you watched this whole video, I just want to say thank you for watching. I tried my best with this idea and I really hope you all liked it. Love y'all, happy Halloween, take care, and I will see you all in the next one.